Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. It's great to be back in Bangalore after a couple of weeks out of Bangalore. I mean, it would be weird to be back in Bangalore if I was still here, wouldn't it now? But anyway, as I told you, I was in New York, fucking New York. Don't know why you have to say it like that, but apparently, if you cross the line even for a second, you have to come back and say that because that's the acknowledged way of showing that you have appreciated and enjoyed New York. But let me tell you one thing. It's weird that I actually felt old and disabled on this trip because, I always have been rejecting the idea. And I always, when I travel, I ask for assistance and I get someone to hold my arm or vice versa. It becomes a very nice bond when we walk through the airport. But this time, I traveled with family. I traveled with my, while going there, I traveled with my sister-in-law and, she was helpful. But at the same time, things have gotten so crowded that you really want to kind of minimize the encounters and the delays and also the navigation for me, because when holding someone's arm, they're like, oh, watch out. So because people are not looking, people are more oblivious and people are kind of more blind than me. And it was weird because I just decided to use a wheelchair and I felt like one of those imposters and one of these people who are just absolutely fine. But of course, those people are just lazy. In my case, I'm also lazy and disabled. So I have a double bonus. And I was whisked through everything. And I realized in one way, I felt like shit. I was like, man, is this what it's come to? I can't really do anything now. When I travel, I have to use a wheelchair and I'm of no help to the people I'm traveling with, whether it's helping my wife carry my baby or carrying luggage. But it's ridiculous because I did try to lift a suitcase and I ended up bumping the suitcase into someone because it's just a mad fucking rush. Anyhow, so having all those, those kind of reservations about traveling and using a wheelchair, then this time I was like, fuck it. I'm 40. I don't care who fucking sees me in a wheelchair. I'm just going to use the benefit of getting through from point A to point B with the least amount of stress and least amount of resistance from various situations. And man, when I landed in JFK, it was a breeze. I landed at 9:05 a.m. I was at the baggage carousel at 9:15, like immigration. The guy's like, sir, please don't get up, sir, because we'll just scan your passport from here. And what's your purpose? He didn't ask me why I'm fucking there. And this is for a guy in 2001 or 2, I think, right after school. I got rejected twice for a student visa on the basis of being a potential immigrant. I mean, this is how the tables have turned. I'm just like cruising through and I realized that this is the benefit of aging, right? I didn't get ID'd for a single thing. I was shown respect. I mean, I was like, what the fuck is going on? And it was quite fascinating and quite enjoyable, if I may say so myself. And yeah, I don't know, man. It was a weirdly exhilarating experience going back after many years. In fact, going back to New York after 9 years. I'll tell you one thing, which is very strange, and I shared this with a couple of my friends, is that, when I went last time to New York, I was not married, but I was still with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. But still, there's this kind of thing where you want to look at New York. And what is New York? What are the bars, the nightlife? You want to check out some pretty girls. And I could still do a little bit of that. I mean, I didn't check out, but I was like, hot girl. And this time, it's not that I'm married and old and I'm wiser. No, it's just that I couldn't see any hot girls. I don't know whether it's whether my sight's gotten worse. And I didn't go to any bars. It was mainly like a home scene. We had an apartment, we had people coming over, we had dinner, and it felt like a very different experience. And I was taking in a lot more through smell and sound. So when I thought back, I was like, yeah, of course, I could capture some images of the apartment we stayed at. I could capture some images of the people who came there. And of course, some of the restaurants we went to, but very limited scope. But no hot chicks. So I feel very buggered because of that. And, there's something I want to talk about, is this concept of muscle memory. And many of you have heard of muscle memory in context of sports, in context of surgeons who have muscle memory, or you build muscle memory when you do a certain thing over time and it comes second nature to you. But have you thought of this concept if a place can trigger muscle memory for you? And I don't mean trigger in the quote unquote, I'm triggered, but can it bring certain physical reactions within your body? And I found that fascinating because I was so dependent on people this time, more so than usual and more so than in the past, I felt like, I was always holding someone's arm while walking on the footpaths. And because I couldn't see more than earlier, I was entirely reliant on them. And the sound, like in a place like New York, in Soho, is loud. There's people talking, there's traffic, there's sirens. And I was fine when I was there. And of course, the smells of New York, you have suddenly coffee shops and you have really, really nice smells, and suddenly you smell sewage and dead rat. So it's, of course, I'm not undermining your visual experience if you have that and you see all these beautiful things. My wife loves people watching, and so does my child. My baby girl loves it. And she's just like, dog, baby, doggy. And I was like, wow. But I've realized this, when you're more reliant on your audio inputs for feedback of your environment, you're much more reactionary, right? So you're kind of suddenly going to jump into like a sudden sound, a loud sound. When you're visually taking in your environment, you're more, I wouldn't say proactive, but you're more prepared for what you're seeing because you see it from a distance. But sound is a lot more abrupt. And as a result, I feel my body took in a lot of these things and took time to process it. And my hands are going all over the fucking place. I apologize. If you're listening, you're actually lucky. And as a result, when I came back, it just felt like this, I won't say stress because that's an overused word, but I felt this kind of energy that had built up in my body, and it was doing weird things to me. And when I came back home and I was in this space, which I'm used to, this environment that I'm able to navigate without a fucking wheelchair or anyone, it felt like this energy needed to come out, and it was a weird experience. Let me just say that. So yeah, let me know what you think about places and their relationship to your body and your muscles and your muscle memory, and what happens to you if that's happened ever when you've gone back to either a holiday place which you really enjoyed, or a place which wasn't a very enjoyable experience, or a place that you visit very often if it's work. Because sometimes every day you go to work, you're not thinking about what happens to your body. You're kind of just thinking about what you're supposed to do. But over a period of time, you kind of build all these thoughts, which kind of then seep into your body and your muscles. And yes, many people say that's stress, and maybe, but also there are different ways of expressing those physical feelings. And we don't have to minimize it and undermine it and just call it stress or anxiety, because yeah, those are of course the most prevalent feelings that we can feel because they make themselves felt. But there are other things that happen to you physically as a result of many moments of things that you take into your body through your senses. So yeah, interesting. But yeah, I miss the hot chicks. It would have been nice. But yeah, man, it's just a crazy city to miss out on. And how much ever, I made peace with the fact that I'm going to listen, I'm going to enjoy the conversations, and I drank a lot of Coors fucking light, cheap ass beer. I loved it. I think there is something to it when you're able to sit back and take in the sights and sounds, because it's not a city made for people who can only hear or smell. Let's put it out there, right? If you are a visually impaired, blind, or if you're hearing impaired or deaf, and I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but I mean, trust me, like in the summer, you want to see those sights. Whew, missed out on that. But it was a good holiday, but I must say I'm happy to be back. And I'm happy to be back to you right here, right now. And let me introduce today's guest, Professor Clive R Boddy, an associate professor of management. He focuses mainly on corporate psychopathy. Now, what is that, right? It sounds cool, but let's talk about corporate. That's all of us at some point in our life, especially if you're in India, corporate life. Oh, for most people in the world, actually, some form of corporate life, right? An organization that you worked at. We know what corporate is. Psychopathy. Now, of course, we typically hear about it like psychopaths, man, these murdering serial killers, these people who are social misfits. Strangely, though, psychopaths aren't just people who kill for the pleasure of killing, or people who do these things, but they display traits which are prevalent even in entertainers, in actors and celebrities and actresses and actresses in various walks of life, where it goes unrecognized because the way it's manifested isn't necessarily criminal, but it does display some behaviors that are not beneficial to all people around these individuals, but they get away with it because of certain things that play to their psychopathic behavior. Now, bring these two together, corporate and psychopaths. Do we have these people? Of course, we call them leaders, we call them managers, we call them people who head organizations. And Clive has focused on studying corporate psychopaths and how their behavior is sometimes encouraged by the corporate environment. How do you find these people? How do you weed them out? How do you recognize this behavior? How do you prevent yourself from getting bullied by these psychopaths? How do you prevent yourself getting manipulated by these people? And a whole lot more. So it's a good conversation, especially if you are experiencing something like this, or if you're contemplating entering the corporate world, or if you are a corporate psychopath. Hey, what's up, buddy? Welcome to the podcast. Great conversation. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And if you're listening, Professor Clive, appreciate you joining me and partaking in this conversation with me. And of course, to you, my friend who's listening right now, I appreciate it as always. Thank you. Until the next episode, goodbye. God bless. Take care of yourself. Cheers. Lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time and joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to understand the reason for you to study this kind of human behavior that people display in a corporation, and what led you to write the book and also take up the study in the behavior that people display.
Well, I came across an article about, it was called Executive Psychopaths in Harvard Business Review. And I realized that I'd worked with one or two people who had many of the same traits as the psychopath. In those days, back in 2004, the notion of a corporate psychopath was not really accepted in corporate society, because psychopaths were all seen as being slightly psychotic people who ended up in jail. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the idea of them being successful and being getting into leadership positions within corporations was quite laughed at first, particularly by academics, mm-hmm. less so by practitioners, I should say. And therefore, I started to study it as a phenomena as part of my DBA that I was doing, a Doctor of Business Administration degree in Australia. And we used a primary psychopathy measure to try and find if there were any psychopaths in corporations. At the time we did it, we had no idea whether we would find any or not. So because it had really never been done before at that stage, 2007, 2008. But we did find some at small incidence rates, but they were definitely there within corporations, and everything since then led on from that initial discovery.
Right, because it seems that these people who you've quoted, I think the study was. I think a lot of the examples were based off Bernie Madoff, right? And his the lot of the traits that he displayed. In many instances, these individuals are used as examples when people are aspiring to be, successful people in the, pursuing or trying to go up the corporate ladder. So a lot of these case studies are given as how to do it, how not, and only when things go bad for the corporation, then they are also made an example of, saying you should never do this. So where does the flip happen? Is it something that is in the person, or is it something that the corporation or the corporate environment brings out of the human being?
Well, like most things, it's an interplay of both. So it's partly personality and partly whether the organization allows the dark side of the personality to flourish or not. So what these people are really after is money, power, and control over other people. Mm-hmm. And that applies to all psychopaths, criminals, as well as corporate psychopaths or successful psychopaths. And they're willing to ride roughshod over anyone to make sure they get to the types of senior positions where they can get the money, power, and control that they want. And that means they're willing to lie to get to the top. They're willing to claim MBAs that they don't have and aren't entitled to. They were willing to claim the good work of others as their own work, and to take credit for other people's efforts. So it's a totally ruthless approach to individual career advancement as they try to get themselves up the greasy pole of corporate hierarchy.
Right. The things you mentioned, which is, of course, trying to take credit for someone else's work, or trying to kind of mislead their way around by kind of, deceiving people with with how much they've actually achieved, or taking, as I said, credit. This happens at all levels at some way, right? Because there's this idea of competition which is driven into people saying, if you have to be anyone at all, just think for yourself, and kind of this idea of nurturing a team, or I mean, it's all said in some sense, right? Like, we're all a team, and you have these exercises for team building in a corporation, but when it comes to it, it's each person for him or herself, and that is quite evident, at least in my personal experience working in corporations. But clearly there are some that are more, I don't know if responsible is the right word, or seem to have a more healthy environment for people. So the thing is, you said it's an interplay of both. It's a personality and the environment. So now, since there is research showing that these individuals do exist, and clearly they have an agenda of money, power, control, have you seen a shift in the way these corporations are organized to prevent these kind of people from gaining a foothold, or to kind of eliminate them at an early stage?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the whole thing is still at an early stage of research, and the whole idea of the corporate psychopath has only been accepted within the past, I don't know, 5 or 10 years maybe. Mm-hmm. And so very few companies are actually screening or looking out for these people, I don't think. And occasionally that some companies are even deliberately looking for them. Mm. I mean, there was one of my more well-known papers was called The Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that you get more psychopathic people in the industry sectors which give you the opportunity to get money, power, and control. And obviously, corporate banking is one of those sectors. And the theory was that if these people get to the top in that sector, then the whole ethical standards of the sector become debased, and we get the reckless, ruthless willingness to gamble with each other people's money that we saw in the last global financial crisis. Yeah. And the results, as we know, were potentially devastating. If governments hadn't stepped in to save the banking sector, then there would have been a radical change in the whole world economy, not necessarily for the better. And so it looks like they go into the sectors where they can get these things. So where you get caring professions, which are lowly paid, like nursing or doctors or beauticians or healthcare workers at the lower end of the healthcare scale, then you get less levels of psychopathy, because that idea of caring for someone else doesn't appeal to the psychopath. They're only out for themselves. And so that and that's why things like corporate responsibility doesn't appeal to them either, because they're not interested in the future for anyone else apart from themselves, and they're out for immediate gratification and short-term gains. And this is one of the reasons why the topic is so important, is because as we stand on the edge of a cliff in terms of climate change and environmental degradation, what we need at the top is caring leaders, not psychopathic leaders who in politics as well as organizations, who don't care about what the future holds for humanity.
Yeah, it's a very scary notion, right? That we're going to be led into the future as, whether it's a society, a nation, or even employees, when you have these people who have displayed such selfishness. And so, as you said, it's definitely there. People like this are attracted by and also go down these avenues where these things are available, at least at the top. But of course, I was recently reading how we have now gone from, there's an economic power struggle to a security power struggle. Now there's a digital, you know, technological kind of struggle going on in the world. So are we seeing this being displayed? Because there's a lot of talk like employees are well taken care of, especially with the new tech giants. But there are things that are being said, but the reality is different, whether it's the lady coming out, the Facebook whistleblower, or the certain conversations coming out of Google with AI, and with Apple employees, kind of saying, or even Twitter employees or Tesla employees. So I'm just naming a few of the tech giants. What is going on there? Because they are run by younger, quote unquote, people. And does that, does youth or age have anything to do with it? Or have you observed that it's across age groups and these kind of psychopaths and psychopathic behaviors displayed across it?
Well, I think it's across all age groups, and both sexes, actually, much more so than I think anybody realizes in terms of female psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I've got a few friends who do work or have worked in the sort of technology sectors you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we find there is what academics call work intensification. So there's a lot of monitoring of what you're doing. You're expected to work long hours. There's a lot of pressure. And the promise is you'll gain from your share options, and that will ultimately make it worth it. But of course, as some of the big groups now are in decline in terms of stock exchange valuations, those share options are no longer attractive enough to keep people. And those companies which are in decline, I think, will start losing their younger managers and middle managers as they seek less intensive work elsewhere.
Mm.
In terms of the cultural restraints on psychopathic behavior, the theory is that the more individualistic the country or the organization, the more this behavior is allowed to flourish. So, of course, America is probably the most individualistic country in the world, followed closely by Australia and the UK and countries like that. And therefore, this individual greed is, to some extent, admired in people. And it's only when it crosses the barrier into dark and outcomes which are not beneficial for the rest of society that we start to notice that individual greed isn't always good, or isn't good at all, maybe.
Yeah. No, because there seems to be a huge emphasis now on what technology can do, and it's very closely tied with, the distinction, I don't know if it's blurring, but political and economic goals are also being driven by technology, and as a result, these few companies, by misinformation. And when you look at all the scandals, quote unquote, when it comes to the elections in the US, or when it comes to I don't know what the name of the company, but the Israeli company that actually was caught out, I think, by the Guardian for running these campaigns to manipulate the results of elections. It clearly, is no longer just a tech guy or a tech person, like, even I think her name's Elizabeth Holmes, like making products for the benefit of mankind, or profits even. But it's clearly beyond that, and it can go into a global scale where people and the destiny of societies and countries can be determined by these people. So what I'm fascinated by is, why do we still kind of when we have money, power, and control as these ingredients that are attracting these people, why as a society are we still holding it to such high values? Why are we telling our children that these are the things that you need to aspire to? These are the jobs that you need to get. These are the sectors that you need to be in. And just like how you pointed out, the ones where you're supposed to care for other human beings, whether it's teachers or nurses or healthcare providers, that is seem to be less rewarding financially, but also not as respected in some way when it comes to setting and shaping your goals for yourself or your children.
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose a part of that direction to these types of organisations and companies is that we as parents, we want our children to do well. We want them to be able to afford a house. We want them to be able to afford good educations for their own children, etc. And therefore, we steer them in the direction of where they can earn more money than elsewhere.
Hmm.
And particularly when you get asset price inflation, like the cost of houses around the world is becoming um, out of all proportion to what people earn. And
Hmm.
therefore, you have to earn, if you're young, you have to, from that sense, earn more as much as you can in order to be able to afford that kind of asset. So it's a function of people trying to take care of their offspring and pushing them in those kind of directions. So it's resulting from care, but it's resulting in disadvantageous outcomes for society. I mean, you mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, I think, or the technology companies.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the things we're looking at, or I'm looking at the moment in cooperation with some of co-researchers, is how AI can be harnessed by these dark and psychopathic managers to produce aberrant results at great scale. Um,
Hmm.
AI, for example, there's a big, I don't know if you've heard of it, there's a big scandal at the moment in Australia. It's referred to as the robo-debt scandal. And so what the welfare part of the government used was an algorithm to determine whether they'd overpaid welfare payments or not to the people in the poorest sectors of society, including
Hmm.
those with mental health issues, those who can't get jobs because of poor education, those with physical illnesses and mental illnesses, those who've been abused. In other words, the very most vulnerable people in society. And what the algorithm did was averaged out their yearly income and issued debt notices to them where that indicated that they had been overpaid welfare payments.
Hmm.
In many cases, um, the, the algorithm was wrong. It produced the wrong result. And up to, I think, 750,000 people were eventually given these debt notices. Some of them committed suicide.
Oh
Um,
God.
some of them sold their houses and cars and whatever they had to pay off these debts. There's just been a report from the Royal Commission into the robo-debt scandal in Australia, and they found the whole thing was illegal from start to finish because the onus of proof was put on the welfare recipients rather than the government offices that were making these judgments.
Hmm.
And the Australian government has had to back down from the whole scheme, end it, and pay people compensation for what they did in the first place. But when these death notices were done by humans by hand, they were doing, I think it was about 30,000 a year. No, sorry, 20,000 a year.
Mm.
When they got AI to do it, artificial intelligence to do it, they could do almost 50 times as much per year. So instead of it being carefully looked at by humans, it was carelessly looked at by AI under the control of managers who were doing it for political gain purposes, because to look good to the voters,
Mm.
and under the guidance of politicians. And so it was just a horrendous, unethical, illegal um, mess in the end, and it's only just coming out. So about 20 people have been referred to possible criminal prosecution under this. And the final report only came out a few days ago, so I haven't read it all yet. But
Mm.
it's just catastrophic from individual people's point of view.
That's
And
terrible. Yeah.
in the UK, there was a similar thing, or again, enabled by artificial intelligence, run at great scale. and it's been referred to as the Great UK Post Office Scandal, where, again, the same accounting system that the post office was using was producing incorrect results at the level of the individual retail post office shop. And they were charging people with fraud who'd never in their lives done anything wrong before, and putting them in prison, including a pregnant woman. And at the end of the day, it's been proven, it's just still going through the courts, but the courts are finding in favour of the people who've been wrongly convicted. And again, thousands and thousands of them have been wrongly convicted, and it's only now coming to light nearly 10 years later. So it's just appalling what ruthless, dark managers can do with the aid of AI, because it magnifies to a tremendous extent the damage they can do to more and more individuals. So these people are actually much more dangerous than criminal psychopaths, because criminal psychopaths just hurt a few people around them, obviously in horrible and bad ways. But these corporate psychopaths can affect thousands and thousands of people badly and change their lives very much for the worse. I mean, Bernie Madoff is a great example of that, as a financial fraudster who has been nominated as a psychopath by several people, including me. Do you remember that financial scandal in New York?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I know the gist of it, but I think it's good to, if you could just highlight maybe some of the things surrounding and the details in that, because just, to set context to what we're talking about.
Well, Bernie Madoff, he was a leading financier in New York. He was chairman of the NASDAQ at one stage, so very well connected in financial, in Wall Street in New York. And he was running a so-called investment, which turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. So in other words, he wasn't investing anything. He was paying back the old investors with money gained from the new investors. And it was all set up to look like a real investment scheme. And in the end, at the time of the global financial crisis, people started to call in their money because they needed it for the purposes. And that virtually exposed the whole fraudulent nature of his scheme. And he was sentenced, I think, in the end to 250 years in prison, which gathered cheers from the courtroom. And thousands of people were bankrupted, or, well, maybe not bankrupted, but lost all their investments right across 40 different countries. So it was a truly global effect. And the total fraud, I think, was anything up $60 billion. But it's hard to say what the total fraud was, because a lot of the numbers were imaginary numbers. They were just made up Bernie. So the real extent of the debt was never really established, but certainly was in the 20s and possibly right up to 60 million.
Wow. The thing I find is, for as long as, I've read documentation, power seems to be concentrated in a few people, and innovation, and even, a lot of people say 5% of the 95% of the wealth in America is in 5% is with 5% of the people. And maybe similarly, there are ideas coming out from 5%, which I don't know if it's true or not. But when we look at more recent examples, like either Elizabeth Holmes or the person, Sam Bankman-Fried, in the age of the internet, where there's quote unquote more transparency, and but on the flip side also more information being exchanged easily, has it made has this environment led for more of these psychopaths to emerge, or is there a way to kind of because it's also empowering us so many more people as opposed to just a few? So I mean, I'm just trying to make an observation, but what is the reality of it? Is there more possibilities? Because you did mention the power of AI and being mishandled by these individuals, but on scale, is more power being put into more people, or is this in fact making the process worse and giving more power back to the few who've controlled these tools?
Well, in terms of the distribution of wealth around the world, it's always been that a few at the top own the majority of the wealth of loads of different countries. I don't think anybody's ever linked that to psychopathy or not. In terms of people like Elizabeth Holmes, I've heard a little bit about it, but I haven't studied it in any depth. I mean, it does show great promise for my area of research, of course, but I can't really comment on her as an individual without further investigation.
Sure.
And that's one of the problems of my area of psychopathic leadership and corporate psychopaths, is there are far too many candidates to look at, to research.
Right.
It shows you how widespread they are.
Right.
But I think in terms of your comment about are these people getting to the top more, I think they are at the moment. And one of the reasons for that is we don't have jobs for life anymore. So we move from organization to organization every 3 years on average, I think it is, in the West. And so the people we work with don't really know us that well, and certainly not enough to want to block our progress up the ladder. Whereas at the same time, as this rapid movement of personnel, you get shallow recruitment processes. So everything seems to be based on an interview these days and a quick look at your CV. And if these people are prepared to lie or in their CV, which they are, then they look good and they get to the interview stage. And at the interview stage, because psychopaths are entirely rational and non-emotional, they can get away with lying because they don't give telltale signs of lying that the rest of us give. So that they're not nervous, they don't lose their temper, they're very cool, calm, and collected, and that makes them look like really good candidates because they don't have this emotional or upsetting response even to accusations of being a liar, for example. And that helps. That's one of the things that helps them get ahead. So they move from one company where they create an internal disaster while claiming great outcomes to their bosses to another company where they do the same thing. And one of the reasons they're able to get ahead so well is they're excellent at upward impression management, so impressing their bosses and superiors. And it's one of the things they do. A good leader looks after those below them.
Yeah.
A bad leader looks after those above them and ignores those below them. So, and this is the essential characteristic of the psychopathic leader. They spend their whole time networking on the phone, talking to people, telling everybody what great results they're getting, regardless of the truth of the situation. And so when those above them are coming to choose who the next group of leaders will be, they automatically think of this psychopathic person as being an excellent candidate. Whereas those who are really getting on with the job and doing it properly and supporting their workers aren't known about by the senior management because they've got their heads down doing their jobs properly and are not shouting for attention like the psychopathic do. And so by the time you get to the top of an organization, the caring and the ethical and the efficient and effective have more or less been weeded out of the selection process because of their lack of ability of getting themselves known and talked about.
Yeah. It seems like behavior that is being displayed more and more by public figures, especially from the outside when you look at it, whether it's, the way they try to manipulate. And that's something that, kind of terrifies me, because when there are so many people hooked on to these platforms which either gives them misinformation or deceives them or puts them into a certain way of thinking, whether it's politically, socially, whether it's with gender, sexuality, so many ways to make us feel separate from the person next to you. It's almost feels like you're creating a sense of dependence for these people, and as a result, more opportunities to manipulate them. And reading articles and reading books on cult leaders to people who eventually were caught, or even dictators, or it could be, as you said, CEOs who led people down a Ponzi scam. It seems like now, of course, you said AI is being misused, but more and more it feels like there's a sort of path being set out for making the population absolutely susceptible to manipulation by a few of these people with much more advanced tools than what they had. Right? Earlier, propaganda was maybe done through word of mouth or through television, but now it's at lightning speed and it's happening constantly, and it's at a click of a few buttons. So it just seems to be facilitating this kind, and in some way rewarding this kind of psychopathic behavior. I didn't have a question there, but I just feel that you were saying the ones who are ethical, the ones who are hardworking, the ones who want to reward. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, this is a point that a professor of leadership made at the end of his career. Is that he worked in consultancy with a lot of organisations in the UK. It just occurred to him that the higher up you go, normally in these corporations, the less caring and the less humanistic the top managers actually are. So it does seem to be the dark who get to the top more than other people. And I suppose one of the reasons for that is they don't have the emotional ties the rest of us have. They don't want to go home to their wives and families because they don't really care about them. They care more about gaining the money and prestige that they're after.
Yeah, because you just now in 2023, we saw the number of layoffs, right? Late 22, early 23, we saw the number of job cuts. And is that a sign of just a company struggling, or is that an act or an action which is being controlled or being exercised by a psychopathic leader?
Well, you have to wonder, don't you, when you have these companies that are making huge profits and at the same time they're laying off thousands of people, you have to wonder what's the rationale behind that. It does seem excessively ruthless to get rid of people when you're a profitable company. Surely, as a benefit to society, you should be employing people, not getting rid of them.
Yeah.
I think going back to your earlier point about how political psychopaths, for example, get ahead as well as organizational psychopaths. What they use very definitely are divide and conquer techniques to pitch people against each other and create divisions in society. And by doing that, they divert attention away from themselves and their own personality and what they're really trying to do, because they get people fighting each other. I mean, for example, we just did some research about a year ago, and where you have a psychopathic manager running organizations, you get more gender discrimination, for example. And my own view is that they're not really biased against the opposite sex. They're just using it as part of this divide and conquer and creating chaos that they use in order to disguise and hide their own activities and divert attention away from themselves. The problem is, as I think you were hinting, even though they're aberrant leaders, and to some extent everyone can see that, especially in politics, they still gain a large minority, in the 39, 40, 41% of the popular vote, whatever they do. You can see that with Trump in America. You can see that with the rise of the Nazis in 20th century Germany, and other politicians as well. They seem to have this big minority of supporters who will support them no matter what. And there was an interesting paper that came out the other day. Sorry, I can't remember the authors. It wasn't me. Which showed that if people have a view of the world as being a scary place, then they're willing to support an authoritarian leader because they think that leader will look after them. So they're trading off the leader's abhorrent behavior with the leader's ability to protect them and look after them, to protect them against this hostile world that they are perceiving. And so what the political psychopaths can do, of course, is play up the hostile world rhetoric in order to gain more support from these types of fearful people in society. So it becomes an almost self-reinforcing cycle.
Yeah, it's almost like, and you kind of, you know, um, make the threat factor that much higher, whether it's religious tension, whether it's the possibility of migrants, whether it's thing. And such, it's so in some ways sad, because maybe 20 years back, it's when you had the world is flat by Thomas Friedman, the whole movement of globalization. Maybe it started earlier. And then you had, like the EU being formed, and, free passage across the continent. And now it seems that everywhere you look, it's more and more isolation and isolation tactics, right? Fear mongering, telling people that, don't trust your neighbor, don't trust people you trusted earlier, like for whatever reason it may be in that particular country, like in Turkey, in India to some extent. But everything then is forgiven, saying, no, but look at the economic progress, or look what the numbers are, look at the amount of investment coming into the country. But whatever it may be, I'm not saying India as an example, just from anywhere you look, it's happening, and happening more and more. So clearly indicating that distractionary tactics are being used by psychopathic political or economic or corporate leaders to kind of let people infight. And I mean, it's quite scary, right? That it's not being checked at all.
Yeah. Well, once they've created these divisions and these infighting activities in society, then it just runs its course on its own. It gains a life of its own, and they can take advantage of it. And I think a lot of them, they know what they're doing is wrong and immoral. They just don't care because they want power, and therefore they choose to do it.
Do psychopathic leaders get along with other psychopathic leaders? Are they willing to collaborate?
There's not much evidence on that. I think they do tend to coalesce together,
Mm-hmm.
as long as they don't get in each other's way. So
Yeah.
if they're all aiming to exploit the company, like the three guys at Enron, for example, if they're all aiming to exploit the company in the same way, then they can work together to do that and just milk it for all the money they can. But if they're fighting each other, then that's a different matter. I mean, there is some evidence that corporations do get more psychopathic over time if they've got a psychopathic leader, because what happens is people who are more sensitive and caring leave the organization because they can't stand working there, whereas more resilient people who are themselves partially psychopathic don't mind as much. And again, there was a paper on this a while ago which showed that the only people who don't really care about working for a psychopathic leader are those who are fairly psychopathic themselves. And it's because they don't have this emotional response that the rest of us have. And so they don't care. They don't get upset about the ruthless bullying, abusive behavior that they see from their leader, because they themselves are relatively ruthless and bullying. So to that extent, like attracts like, and they're prepared to work in that kind of environment that the rest of us would find unhospitable.
But it almost seems like, especially in the corporate, I mean, not just corporate, but in all these areas we spoke about, it seems like if you are going to be working for the people, if you're actually looking out for your team, or if you're actually trying to do some good, there's no hope. So you rather, instead of being smothered by the absolute psychopaths, it seems like it's best to play the game, develop a little bit of psychopathy, and at least be around so you can mitigate the damage that these people inflict.
Well, yes. I mean, I've often thought in my own career, for example, sometimes I've turned down a leadership position because because in my case, I just want to concentrate on my research. But sometimes looking back at that, I've wished I'd taken it rather than not taken it, because what happens is they just give it to someone who turns out to be rather toxic and makes your life miserable by being a poor leader. So those of us who do care about other people, I think, have to perhaps step up to the plate a bit more and take on these roles. Otherwise, they'll just be taken by the ruthless.
Right. On the flip side to this, I just had a thought. There are of course, these toxic leaders, the psychopaths, displaying this behavior. But now there's this new movement of, I don't want to say left leaning, but you have this movement against toxic culture, right? Whether it's toxic masculinity or and you see a lot of these situations leading to quote unquote cancelled culture, where people who have felt abused at the workplace, starting a movement and bringing down these people. So is this a reactionary movement, or is it a simultaneous movement which is as unhealthy?
Honestly don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I mean, what I've found in one or two cases that I've looked at, and there was one case, I won't be too specific. It was in the UK. It was the uniformed services area of life, and a junior officer contacted me because of my work on toxic leadership, and I gave him advice over a couple of years or so. And eventually he made an open bullying accusation against senior officer. And when he did that, about 20 odd other people came forward with the same allegations. So the guy had been bullying loads of people at different stages of his career. And so this sort of Me Too movement of people getting together and pointing out that these people are sexual harassers or bullies or abusers of some kind does seem to be gaining traction, which is good. And the thing is, a lot of these people have multiple victims and always have had multiple victims, like Epstein, for example. And it's only when you gather them together, you get this additional power of being able to expose these people in a way that at a single individual level, it's very hard to do, because there's an asymmetry of power and wealth and influence between you as the victim and them as the perpetrator. So it's only when you get a big group of people together that you can overcome that particular hindrance to justice.
Yeah, it seems like it's quite a devious thing, right? To keep the compartmentalization quite leak proof, that a person thinks that he or she's alone in this. But and that's, as you said, then it seems like it opening up a can of worms. Then it goes for years with multiple people experiencing this, as you said, various forms of oppression, abuse. But yeah, it's just it seems extremely scary that it's not being addressed at any level, because except for, of course, once it leads to fraud, or it leads to complete the facade being pulled down, like Jeffrey Epstein, or whether it's with these other corporate scandals that we've seen in the recent past. But is there anything you can talk about in today's example which you looking into, or something which you can talk about when it comes to either a corporate or an individual who's this psychopathic leader?
I'm not looking at the moment. I'm not looking at individuals. I'm looking at the more of the effects of their presence in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, for example, it's pretty obviously things like job satisfaction decrease when you have this type of leadership. Well-being and mental health decrease, and we're just trying to publish a paper on that at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the range of things that go down, you know, ethical behavior decreases, moral behavior decreases, sabotage goes up because people try to take revenge on the company for putting a bad leader, a toxic leader, as their leader, as their boss. So rather than take revenge on the boss, they take revenge on the company itself by small acts of sabotage and production deviance, and deliberately jeopardizing the efficient running of the business.
Mm-hmm.
So it has these multiple negative effects that the organization might not even be aware of, because of the bad behavior that they're experiencing, and particularly the abusive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of the things that these people do is, of course, sexual harassment, but that's very hard to measure and identify in the workplace because it's so sensitive and embarrassing for people to admit to sometimes, particularly if they've been coerced into activity that they wouldn't normally get involved in. And so I've deliberately not gone into investigating that to any extent, because but quite often you get the sense that it's there and that people have been harassed in more ways than just being bullied, for example.
Yeah. You know, when people like this apply for companies for jobs, or whether it's like, you know, interns at, you hear it, whether it's in political circles where people want to start, and of course, we've covered this in some sense earlier, but you know, I know you said that now there are companies who are actively trying to screen for these kind of individuals, but it's also individuals applying for companies sometimes unknowingly, who are run by people like this. But of course, the public image is so well coated, right? They've got great PR teams, and as you said, they're very smart people who are able to kind of put this front when by hiding their true intentions or their true motive to what they're doing, because they're running all these various campaigns of dividing and distracting and keeping people in the dark and keeping people chasing their own tails. So what are some of the symptoms an individual might display before getting the power? Because once all this is a means to getting to that place where they can control money, power, but for whether it's colleagues or whether it's people applying for companies, what are some of the things? Because usually just the money, the number of hours, it's the number of shares, it's how many days of leave you get. But are there other things they should look for while applying for a job, or while they're in a job and they kind of are noticing things? Are there some traits or symptoms or things they should look for?
Well, we've just done a piece of research which looks at the attributes that people think transformational leaders have compared to the attributes people think psychopathic leaders have. In academic terms, transformational leaders are deemed to be the best type of leaders because they transform the lives of those who work for them, as well as the effectiveness and outcomes for the company. So everything moves in a positive direction, both for the employees and the company as a whole, and things like teamwork and all that kind of stuff. And so transformational leaders are the ideal form of leaders, ideal type of leaders. The interesting thing about the finding, and I'm going to present this in Canada in November, I think it's. Is it? No, October.
Mm.
Um, so transformational leaders, as I said, are held as the ideal leaders. The problem is when you first meet a psychopathic leader, they're they're rated as being calmer, more rational, more poised, more social, more friendly than transformational leaders are. So when you first meet them, they look like ideal leaders. They look absolutely perfect, and
Mm.
that's almost too good to be true. So in terms of a warning sign, if they look almost too good to be true, then it's worth investigating whether they are too good to be true.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and this is the reason they get, or one of the reasons that they get appointed to senior positions. And it's so only when they're in place in that position that their true conning and lying and deceit and dishonesty and manipulation comes through. And by that time, of course, it's too late. They're
Yeah.
already in a powerful position. So, in terms of um, looking out for them, if they look too good to be true, then they might be too good to be true. But also, another way to identify them is if those below them rate them as the devil in a suit, and those above them rate them as a star employee, then
Mm.
this massive difference in evaluation is a good way to identify them as well. Because, as I said, they spend their whole lives impressing those above them. And so those below them are the first people to really know what's happening, and to identify them as of course, they wouldn't necessarily use the word psychopathic, but they certainly know they're selfish and lying and abusive, and toxic. Um, and so that's two ways of trying to see who they are.
Mm. That's, I think, really good to know, because sometimes we just get so blindsided by these other things, right? Like the pay offer, the free food in the cafeteria, these various
Yeah.
things. But clearly, the reward system is something that a lot of the people displaying these traits are seeking. But before even the workplace or before even the professional aspect, a lot of them go through the regular system of, whether it's education and higher education and the entrance entrance procedure, whether it's into a civil servant position or whether it's to get into politics. There's some level of that. But is there a way to identify this at a younger age, whether it's in school or whether it's in university or whether it's in business school? Because it seems like it's not just that the workplace or the professional life that turns on this button, but it's clearly it's clearly there, and it's clearly, I think that those traits are sort of self-fulfilling and they're going down a path. So you know, how does the education system weed out these people, or does it reward these individuals?
But I don't really think the educational system is set up to identify that type of person. Obviously, if they're extremely bullying and abusive, they'll come to the attention of the head teacher or the authorities in the school. And what psychologists refer to in terms of youth psychopathy is, they say it's callous and unemotional behavior. So they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to label young people as psychopathic
Mm-hmm.
because that will affect the rest of their lives, perhaps. So they talk about callous and unemotional behavior. So you have things of, bullying is a typical particular example. Hurting animals on purpose is another identifier.
Mm.
Uh, Not caring about their friends and colleagues is another identifier, their schoolmate. Um, but of course, the difficulty is what do you do with these people? How do you deal with them? And those who are from good socio-economic backgrounds will be protected by their parents so that they don't become criminalized, for example, and they are let off by the school and they work their way up through university
Mm-hmm.
by cheating and by copying the work of other people. Um, and by doing that, they get into corporate life. Um, but psychologists are coming to the conclusion, I mean, it's not 100%, that these people are born like, basically.
Mm.
So they're born with an emotional deficit in their brains. The emotional areas of the brain don't work in the same way as the rest of us, and they're almost entirely rational. I would say that they're actually the only rational people around, because the
Hmm.
rest of us are governed by emotions as well as rationality, and a
Right.
mixture of the two. Whereas psychopaths are purely rational. Um, and their violence is rational violence. It's aimed at a particular aim, whether that's hurting someone or whether that's manipulating them or coercing them or getting them to do something. It's not emotional violence. It's not reactive. It's very deliberative, uh, and that's one of their, as I say, one of their characteristics. So the only real economic man or economic human that the economists talk about in their economic theories of economic behavior is a psychopath. The rest of us are emotional.
And the fact that it's so strategic and it's so emotionless makes it even more, um, hard hitting. That it's not something that is done out of spite, but it's done for a pure, measured result, and that's pretty hard to it's, to process. You hear of so many people just after the dust is settled, they've stolen, they pilfered millions of dollars and billions even, and it's just that it just feels like they're not. I wouldn't say punished by going to prison, but it just feels like there's no remorse. And
Yeah,
even in comedy, you had mentioned comedy was an interesting place. There's a lot of that behavior which is rewarded. It's not the genuinely funny people who are nurturing other comedians, but it's the ones who play the game that people say quote unquote play the game. But it's this kind of behavior which is what takes them to the top. And I find that quite it's something I did for 13 years, and it started getting to me, like, you have to be that person. Otherwise, people are like, oh, do it for your passion. But yeah, it's disheartening, when the genuine willingness to help people, or the genuine willingness to kind of bring people along, all that is kind of just not rewarded. But it's the ones who finally then get to such levels where they're selling out arenas, and then you have to be like them, and that's quite an interesting paddle that it can be in all aspects of life.
well, yeah, it's funny. Talking about humor reminds me of another piece of research we did,
Hmm.
and we looked at um, dark humor and the
Hmm.
use of dark humor in the workplace. And basically, according to the literature, a good leader will use humor to diffuse situations, to make light of situations, to make people happy and get along with each other. But psychopathic leaders also use humor, but they use dark humor. So again, this is another way of perhaps identifying them. So they laugh at the misfortunes of other people. They ridicule those who work for them. They're very sarcastic. Um, and they use all these different forms, as I say, of dark humor to manipulate their environment. And it's part of their abusive behavior. So if you
Mm.
see a person using these individually antagonistic humor towards people, like ridicule and sarcasm, then that's a good indicator that they are a dark personality themselves, and possibly psychopathic. Uh, yeah, so yeah, a good another way of possibly identifying them in the organizations.
I'm assuming they're also not self-deprecating and they can't take a joke.
We didn't look at that, but I would guess that
Yeah.
that's the case.
Right. No, before we wind up, because you spoke about transformational leaders, um, and I think that can you give me a couple of examples? Because I don't know if you want to name names, but it would be nice to just hear who's someone that people can kind of look as a case study or an example of an individual who's transformational in their work.
Transformation. Well, I haven't really looked at that. I mean, a good a good writer on transformation and on good leadership in general. It's called a guy called Robert Hogan. But I think we talk about it in more general terms rather than in specific individual terms.
Okay, right.
I mean, you might give in political terms, you might give the example of Winston Churchill as a transformational leader because he motivated the country towards, fighting the Nazis. What we do find is good leaders tend to be more humble and more, as you said, self-depreciating, and they don't put themselves first. Whereas a toxic leader is the opposite of those things. They're grandiose and self-important and always put themselves first. And again, this is probably one of the ways they get advancement, because when you meet a humble person who doesn't stand out from the crowd, you tend not to associate them with leadership, whereas actually you probably should.
That's nice to hear, because we always are attracted to the loudest in the room, the quote unquote most powerful person in the room. But it's nice to also look out for the quiet. But some people, they don't trust the quiet ones. So who knows? But recently I heard that Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk have challenged each other to a cage match. And I know this might not be supported in research, and I'm just asking you this question as someone who's good at reading human behavior. And I don't obviously want you to put your name on the line or any of that, but just as an observer, as a person living in society, looking at these two people who control these such huge platforms, who are going at it like school children, who are threatened by each other. And it so claims that Elon Musk was threatened by the fact that Mark Zuckerberg is launching Threads, which is the rival to Twitter. Or say, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk sending each other some kind of prank gifts, which just to go to show that I have more money than you, or I'm a bigger billionaire, or I'm the richest man in the world. So these are, of course, the big names that are being, presented today in the media. So one is, I just want your thoughts on that. But secondly, once it gets to that level, are there also certain game plans that these individuals adopt to propagate their strategy to dominate?
Well, I hadn't heard of the potential boxing match, and I don't know enough about these people as individuals to really comment. It sounds childish to me rather than psychopathic.
Right.
But in terms of how they dominate companies, it's very much they generate a climate of fear, basically, among those who work under them. And so nobody's, or very few people have got the courage and strength of character to be a whistleblower, for example. So they're ruled by fear and intimidation, which discourages anyone from challenging their position, which enables them to get away with what they're doing.
Right. No, and what I was interested to know is, like, for instance, let's just take, without accusations. Okay, let's take Jeff Bezos, right? He started a marketplace for people to buy stuff and then became one of the biggest in the world, if not the biggest. But in the process, or say someone like Bill Gates, he wanted to make software which was accessible to desktop computing. But on the way, it moved away from the central thing, which was technology, in case of Amazon, which was marketplace, which was shopping online, to various other things, which was owning a newspaper in the case of Jeff Bezos, or to setting up a foundation, which was to do things, when it comes to Bill Gates, or when it comes to Elon Musk, from electric car company or like a rocket company to now owning a social media platform. So it seems like controlling the news or what information people receive seems to be a thing. Like, even what's the guy who owns Fox? I forget his name.
Murdoch.
Yeah, Murdoch. So it seems like eventually they deviate from their core whether it's people who started something, and it seems at the end of the, not end of the road, but one of the important things that they need to get is to control information and own the source of that information. And how does, so is that something, that a pattern that we're seeing?
Again, I don't know enough about these people. As I said at the beginning, a problem of my area of research is there's too many candidates to study. You can't study everybody. But in terms of media barons, one of the case studies I use is a guy called Robert Maxwell. I don't know if you remember him.
I've heard of Robert.
UK.
Yeah.
He was a rival of Murdoch at one stage, and owned a series of newspapers in the UK.
That's Ghislaine Maxwell's father, right? He's the son.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. The Sun newspaper, I think that was his.
The Mirror Group, I think it was.
Oh, yeah. The Mirror, right.
Well, yes. I mean, the point you mentioned his daughter. The point there is an hereditary element to psychopathy, and also there's a socialization element, and having that kind of father who reportedly used a belt to discipline his children, for example, a leather belt, would tend to make you into a abusive person yourself, and therefore the Ghislaine situation. But yeah, he was found to have stolen from his own pension, the company pension fund. I think it was 300 million, which was a huge fraud one of the biggest frauds in the UK at the time. And lots of his workers and pensioners lost about half of their pension, half of their savings that they thought they'd saved up to take them into old age. So again, poor outcomes for everybody apart from the psychopathic leader himself.
Wow, it seems like it repeats itself in all parts and all ages. And well, thank you so much, Professor Clive, for sharing your research, the data, and your insights into this kind of behavior. Because I've not been in a corporate environment and in a position of power at all, but it's very, very, very interesting and also kind of grounding to hear that we have these number of individuals, but also an increasing number of individuals who are displaying this behavior. So I think on behalf of my listeners and myself, thank you so much for joining me today and for taking the time to share all the findings from the work you've done.
Thank you. You're welcome.